Hi, Manny Talavera here. I really appreciate you taking a look at my video today. A few years back, I created a product called The History of the Internet, and it simply told the story or backstory of people like J. Abraham, Dan Kennedy, Frank Kern, and several others. And what it talks about is how those people got their start, what they were like before they were superstars. What I've decided to do is simply reshoot these stories, tell these stories again, and basically give them away. My goal is that you'll get some value from understanding how these people got their starts. Now, I've got a lot of content to cover, so let's get started. Dan Kennedy is from Cleveland, Ohio. And my understanding of the very beginnings, or when Dan was essentially in grade school, is that when Dan's father and mother were married, Dan's father had built a very successful business. And I'm not sure if it was in direct mail or direct response, but I can tell you they had an in-ground pool, they had a very big house, they had maids, they had staff, and this went on for a few years, and ultimately Dan's father and mother split up. And when they split up, there was a real reversal of fortune. So essentially, what we're talking about here is a riches to rags story. And ultimately, Dan ended up living with his father after the divorce. And I can tell you that he struggled throughout high school. They were very poor. They did not have a lot of money. And they essentially struggled to make ends meet. As a matter of fact, for quite a while, Dan and his dad were both selling Amway at the same time, and they were sharing a car. So that kind of gives you an idea of how that bad things essentially had went. But I can tell you that when Dan was in high school, around the time he was 16 or 17, he actually entered a contest that Gary Halbert was having. And the contest was essentially a beat the control contest. And if you beat the control, you won $500. Now, a beat the control contest, for all of you out there who might not be aware of what that actually entails, essentially what you have is you have someone who is running an ad. And that ad is performing very well, so it's a control. And what they will do is they will have people essentially try to beat that control or write an ad that actually does better than the control ad that's being ran. And Dan actually wrote an ad that ultimately beat Gary Halbert's control, and he won the money. And once he won that money, it really changed the way he thought about making money. He figured out that he could essentially make money by putting words on paper, by actually writing instead of actually getting a regular job or something like that. So this had a real profound effect on him. Now, again, throughout his high school years, Dan and his dad both sold Amway, and like I said, they shared a car. And Dan had a really strong work ethic, and he got it from his dad. I'll tell you a story about Dan when he was a little bit younger. When Dan's dad and mom were still married, every day from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m., Dan's dad made cold calls. He had an office in the basement. He went down, and you did not interrupt him under any circumstances. Well, they had a farm, and Dan was cleaning a stall, and somehow he got between a horse and the stall rail, and the horse backed into him, and Dan broke his arm. And it was a compound fracture, and the bone was actually sticking out of the skin a little bit. And Dan went into the house, and Dan's mom immediately said, "We need to go tell your dad." And Dan was not having any of that. Dan knew that like interrupting his dad for any kind of emergency even was not a good idea. And Dan said, "No, let's not tell Dad. Let's clean it off. Let's wrap it up in gauze. Let's put some ice on it. And when Dad comes upstairs at 5 o'clock, he can take us to the hospital." Now, she wasn't having any of that, right? So she goes and tells Dan's dad. Dan's dad essentially comes upstairs, takes a look at it, and says, "It's not that bad. Why don't you wipe it off, put some gauze on it, put some ice on it, and at 5 o'clock I can take him to the hospital." So like I said, Dan got his work ethic essentially from his dad at a very early start. Dan only had 2 jobs in his whole life. The first job he had was working at a bar called the Bowery, and he worked there through high school. Essentially, he didn't get paid anything. It was basically a place to drink for free. And this bar, essentially, what he did there is he actually cleaned tables, he bartended, he cooked. He basically did everything in the bar, and he didn't really get paid for it. But he really liked working with those people. And even after Dan made substantial money, he would actually show up sometimes and go and work at the bar because he really, really liked the energy and the people who were working there. Now, after Dan graduated high school, he actually tried creating his own ad agency, and he really didn't have any luck getting clients. And so he actually ultimately applied for a job with Price, Stern, and Sloan. And Price, Stern, and Sloan, they were essentially a book publisher, and Dan had applied for a Midwest territory. So essentially, he would be traveling around to bookstores, gift shops, and places like that, selling accounts, selling selling books and anything else that they were actually carrying. Now, what you need to understand is that when Dan originally filled the application out to get this job, he completely fabricated it, and he talks a lot about this in one of his books. To qualify for the job, essentially, you needed to have some college, you needed to have experience working in an advertising publication or something like that, and you also needed to have a dependable car. Now, Dan had neither of these three, but when he applied for the job, he said he had a dependable car, and he also said that he'd actually worked for an advertising publication. Now, what's interesting is the advertising publication he put on the application was an advertising publication that he owned that ultimately had never really got off of the ground or got any clients. And his car, Dan said when he applied for the job, he was just hoping his car would make it 30 days because he knew if he made it 30 days, they would give him a company car and he wouldn't have to rely on his car any longer. The car Dan shared with his dad, Dan bought on payments for like $125 total, and the frame was actually wired together because it was cracked. And what ultimately happened with this car, again, Dan lives in Cleveland and the winters are really, really bad. And they actually live on a farm, and Dan basically drove the car into the driveway and pulled it off into the yard, and then there was a very, very big snow. Dan couldn't get the car out of the yard and ultimately called the tow truck. And when the tow truck came to pull Dan's car out, they hooked the tow truck up to the car. They pulled the car. Half of the car came out of the driveway and half of the car was still in the driveway. Essentially, the car broke in two pieces. So the car wasn't in very good shape. And like I said, Dan talks a lot about the fact that he fabricated the application. And what he essentially said is that he doesn't agree with it or disagree with it, but he said that a lot of people do it. And he said also that when you want something really badly, you'll do what you have to do to get it. And that was his mindset. And so Dan worked at Price, Stern, and Sloan for about a year. And the job wasn't going very well. He was basically a territory sales rep and didn't like it. And he essentially, after 1 year, he quit because he felt like if he didn't quit, they were going to fire him anyway. And then what he did is he went back to actually starting his own, basically ad copy or advertising product where he was actually working with other business owners, helping them to write ads and do things like that. Shortly after he went back to working for himself, he ran into a neighbor of his, and his neighbor owned a business called ESI, which stands for like Enclosure Systems International. And ESI, they were in the business of selling plastic domes. So they could create a plastic dome enclosure for pretty much anything. They created them for tennis courts. They created them for very, very large construction sites. And what they had created was a product where they could actually enclose a structure with, like I said, a plastic dome. And they were struggling quite a bit. And once they hired Dan to start writing ads for them, the company took off very, very fast, and Dan essentially saved the company. What happened though is the company grew too quick, and ultimately the owner of the company was approached by a rubber manufacturer, and this rubber manufacturer essentially said, we're willing to make a large investment in your company, but what you got to do is you got to start using our vinyl, because what it was is the ESI was actually using vinyl from a competitor. And so ultimately what happened is they took this investment from this company, but unfortunately the vinyl this company was actually creating was inferior. And so what happened, they were building all of these domes, but the sun would hit the dome and essentially erode the very, very top of it. And as the dome eroded at the top, the thing would essentially collapse on itself. And this led to a lot of lawsuits. There was a company in Texas who had one of these domes built, and it was over a $1 million rose growing operation. The sun melted the top of the dome. The dome essentially collapsed and crushed like $1 million worth of roses. And so the company essentially was sued out of business. So Dan essentially went back to what he was doing. He was essentially looking for clients to write ad copy for. And he stumbled onto an ad in the newspaper. And the ad essentially said, "We are looking for a copywriter who has read Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich and Eugene Schwartz's The Magic of Thinking Big." Dan was really, really intrigued by this ad, and he called, and he wanted to talk to the person who wrote the ad. He left a message with the secretary, and then for the next 3 days he called and left messages, and on like the third day, the secretary essentially said, that spot has been filled. We're no longer looking for applicants or anyone to fill that spot, so there would be no reason to talk to the person who ran the ad. And what Dan essentially said is, he said, "I don't care whether the job's available. I just want to talk to the person who ran the ad." And he still got no response. And so what he ultimately did, he sent a telegram to the company, and that telegram ultimately got him a phone call from James Tolson. And James Tolson essentially called him and said, "I'm going to give you 15 minutes. And this is essentially how Dan met James Tolson. And this would essentially change Dan's life. James Tolson was a highly successful used car salesman. He owned a number of dealerships and used car lots. At some point, someone had invited him to a seminar. When he went to the seminar, on stage, Glenn Turner was selling a Dare to Be Great franchise for $5,000. This franchise included a bunch of cassettes, a discount on travel, a cosmetic line that you could sell, but not only could you sell the cosmetic line, you could get people underneath you to sell it, so there was a network marketing component to it. Plus, you got unlimited lifetime seminars, so it was a lifetime learning program. James Tolson was amazed by this. He went home, called everyone in all of his companies, and he essentially said, "I'm going to invest in this Dare to Be Great franchise, and I'm taking 6 months off." And so what happened is James did very, very well, very, very fast. Unfortunately, about the time he got his business up and running, the U.S. government came in and basically put Glenn Turner out of business. He was sued in 48 of the 50 states, and he was no longer allowed to operate. And so James Tolson was now in a position where he had to create his own content, and he was wanting to essentially build that same exact model. He had made a lot of money, but at the same time he was spending a lot of money because James was never really any good with understanding expenses or accounting or anything like that. He just brought in a lot of money and he spent it as it came in. And so Dan ultimately meets with him. They're supposed to meet for 15 minutes, and they end up meeting for 2 or 3 hours. And what ultimately happens is Dan gets hired by James to come work for him as a copywriter, like as a vice president in charge of copywriting or something. James gives Dan a check for $5,000, and ultimately the check bounces. But this meeting essentially creates a friendship that lasts for a very, very long time. And what ultimately happens is they build this product, and they build it very, very fast. And what they're ultimately doing is they're selling a $399 package as lead generation to put people into seminars. And when people come to those seminars, they're also selling the same type of a franchise. They're selling a large package. And they were doing very, very well with this. I mean, in a short amount of time, they had ran this business to $1 million a month. And the problem with that is that James Tolson was never really good with accounting or expenses, and so they were spending money as quickly as it was coming in. They were selling these packages so fast that FedEx would back a truck up that was empty one day. They would take a truck that was full that day, and then the next day they would do the same thing. They would leave an empty truck and take a truck that was full. And that's the amount of cassettes that were going out of this office as lead generation to put people into a room to sell these programs. And they were selling these programs all over the country. They had a lot of people selling for them. Glenn was on the road selling, Dan was on the road selling, and they had a number of other salespeople. The salespeople were making $20,000 to $25,000 a week as a commission for selling these high-ticket packages. The problem, again, is James Tolson was spending money as quickly as it was coming in. And so what would happen is as things started slowing down, as sales slowed down, James would essentially go back to old customers and say, if you bring in new customers, I'm going to give you $1,000 for everyone you bring in, and I'm going to give you $1,000 for everyone they bring in. That's the kind of operation that he was doing, and it looked like a pyramid scheme. The other thing that he was doing is he was soliciting private investors. Now, they would actually have a lot of meetings with private investors. Most of the time, Dan would go on those meetings. For some reason, they had a meeting and Dan didn't happen to go to the meeting. But ultimately, James goes to a meeting, takes $10,000 from a potential investor, and he gets arrested on the spot. And he's charged with a bunch of security violations. Now, technically, Dan did not feel that James had broken any laws. And James was essentially facing 5 years in prison. And ultimately what happens is generally this is settled with the SEC. They come in, they fine you, they put you out of business. But generally people don't go to jail for this. But this prosecutor wanted to make a name for himself. And so ultimately James goes to prison for 5 years. Now what's interesting about this whole thing is that they had this long line of witnesses that were willing to testify that they were happy with the arrangement. And the government never brought anyone in who said that they were cheated, they were lied to, they were tricked into investing. The government didn't have any witnesses who said they lost money, but James was still ultimately convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. And this gave Dan a really bad taste for government, and he was very distrustful of the government from then on out. Now, Dan was in the process of moving to Phoenix, Arizona, because that was a real hotbed for speaking at the time. And he was basically now on his own to earn his own money, and he was also trying to figure out a way to get James out of jail. So what ultimately happens, he moves to Phoenix, and at that time, you could get credit cards pretty easily because there was deregulation in the banking industry, and you could get credit cards from any bank. And so what Dan did on a Friday, he drove to every bank within a couple of 100 miles of them, and he got a credit card application. And then on Monday, he went in and turned in all of those credit card applications, because back then it took a couple of weeks for them to kind of get the credit reporting back. So no one would see that he was applying for all these credit cards. Dan was ultimately able to get $140,000 in credit. And he did this because the appeal was going to cost $50,000, and the paperwork to file the appeal and all that was going to cost another $30,000. So Dan essentially invested $80,000 in this thing to get James out of jail. And what they did is they hired an attorney in Michigan. The attorney flew from Michigan to Ohio. The attorney met up with a stewardess on the airplane, uh, ended up staying at her house that night, missed the appeal process, did not show up at all, and they lost their $80,000. And Tolson ended up doing 3 years in jail. That's what he ultimately ended up doing. And this here again, if you hear Dan talking about attorneys, this really colored the way he felt about attorneys, because he felt that these people basically stole his money. And ultimately, like I said, this also showed where he kind of gets his ideas about how he felt about the government. But ultimately what happens is Tolson gets out of jail. And they decide to just take off right where they left off, and they do that. And they hit the ground running, and they're immediately doing $1 million a month again. Very, very short amount of time. But the problem is, Dan is very, very fearful that the government could come in and say the same thing they said before. And so what Dan said is that everyone had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and then ultimately came in and said everyone had to also sign a disclosure agreement that they knew that Tolson had been in prison, and they still wanted to invest the money, and they knew exactly what they were buying. And ultimately what happened is, a few weeks or a few months into this process, Dan found out that not everyone was signing these disclosures. Tolson was essentially running a lot of people through the system, was not having them fill out the paperwork, and Dan, like I said, was fearful of the government, and Dan essentially cut ties with James Tolson. He essentially sent James a cease and desist letter. He said, you can't use my name, you can't use my likeness, you can't use any of my content. And Dan ultimately went off on his own. And what Dan started doing is the same thing he had been doing the whole time Tolson was in jail. In Arizona, the speaking thing was really, really big as far as speaking to real estate agents and car dealerships. And Dan had built a system for actually going to real estate agents and car dealerships, getting speaking arrangements, going in and speaking for free. And at the end of that speech or talk, he would essentially either sell a group of cassettes and give them a seminar for buying the cassettes, giving them a free seminar on the weekend, or he would sell the seminar and give them the cassettes for buying the seminar. And so he had two different processes. But ultimately, he was speaking at real estate agents and car lots all over Arizona. And what he would do is he would speak 4 or 5 days a week. And on the weekend, he had this place called the Learning Center that he had essentially rented. And he would actually do seminars on the weekends. And he would bring people in. And he would do these basically group talks. And he would sell a little bit of coaching and things like that. Unfortunately, Dan had ran up quite a large credit card debt trying to get Tolson out of jail. And while Dan was making about $200,000 a year speaking, he could not make it with the credit card debt, and ultimately he ended up filing bankruptcy. But before he did that, what he was receiving was a lot of notices from credit card companies. So he would get a first notice, and then a second notice, and then a third notice, and then the final notice would essentially be the fourth notice with the first 3 notices stapled to it. And that's how Dan created his 4-step mail process. It came from collection agencies sending him collections letters. So Dan was making about $200,000 a year with his speaking business, and he decided to go to the National Speakers Association to learn how to actually build a speaking business on a solid foundation, because he, up to this point, was self-taught. And he went to the National Speakers Association, and what happened is he was very, very disappointed. He spent 5 days there, and what he found was everyone in the room was either A, not making any money at all, or B, they were making $20,000 a year or so. And he spent 5 days there. He was very, very disappointed. So he was leaving. He was at the airport, and he ran into Buster Crabbe. Buster Crabbe was a former celebrity who also had a speaking business. And Buster essentially said, Dan, what did you think of the seminar? And Dan just said, I'm very, very disappointed. I'm making $200,000 a year. I came to see if I could figure out a way to actually grow this and do it better. And I didn't really learn anything at all. And Dan said, Buster, what did you think of it? And Buster essentially said the same thing. He said, Dan, I'm in the speaking business. I'm doing about 60 to 70,000 a year. Most of the people in the room were not making very much money, and I didn't learn anything. And these two people had a conversation, and what ultimately happened is Buster Crabbe gave Dan Kennedy $600 to hire him as a speaking coach to help him build his speaking business. And Dan, when he got off the airplane in Phoenix, essentially rented the National Speakers Association's mailing list, and he sent an offer to 1,600 people. And what he did is he offered them a newsletter subscription for like $200 or $300 a year. And he said, if you buy this newsletter subscription, I will teach you how to make money in the speaking business. And from this mailing list, Dan made like $9,000 or $10,000. But rather than spending the money, what he did is he sold the newsletter to this group over here. This group over here did not buy it, but what Dan did is he mailed it to both groups. He created a newsletter for the speaking business, and he started selling coaching to speakers. And if you watch the Advanced Coaching and Consulting, Dan does state that most of the money that he has made has been generated by newsletters. Dan ultimately had a newsletter for speakers. He had a newsletter for coaches. He had a newsletter for consultants. He had a newsletter for chiropractors. He was in the newsletter business, and what he was essentially doing was putting out a monthly newsletter. And in that newsletter, he would offer products, services, coaching, packaged products, and things like that. And that's essentially how he was selling a lot of what he was selling. And I can tell you, one of the things that really shaped the way Dan thought about things was a book that was written by J.J. Arms. J.J. Arms was a private investigator out of California in the 60s and 70s. And J.J. Arms, when he was very young, he was playing on a railroad track, and what they were doing is they were blowing up land to kind of build track. And he came across a box that had a torpedo in it. And when he opened the box, the torpedo blew up, and it blew his hands off. And he went to the hospital, and they saved his life, but he didn't have hands. And ultimately, he became one of the highest paid private investigators in the country, and he actually was on a lot of TV shows. He was in a few movies. But ultimately, they had created a TV show based on his life, and the TV show was Nero Wolfe. And the Nero Wolfe character is basically a character who's a recluse. He basically stays at home, and to actually get a meeting with this guy, you have to be willing to spend $100,000. So Nero Wolfe was this famous private investigator. He basically said, I guarantee all of my work, I stay on a case until it's solved, but you had to have $100,000 to hire him. And so in order to actually hire the guy, you had to come with a check for $100,000. You would give him the check for $100,000. You would essentially tell him your situation, and then he would decide overnight whether he was going to take your check or not. Now, I want you to think about that story in terms of how Dan sets up his business. Dan doesn't go to see other people come to see him. The first thing that you have to book is you have to book a strategy day. And a strategy day, as this recording, is I think around $14,600. There are a lot of hoops you have to go through just to get to that strategy day. But essentially, you come to the strategy day, you basically pay the $14,600, and then if you have a project that is worthwhile, Dan might work with you on it. But I want you to think about that because, like I said, Dan actually got that from the book J.J. Arms' Private Investigator. So Dan ultimately built a number of very good-sized businesses in the coaching niche, in the speaking niche, and in the copywriting niche. And he worked for a few years on his own. And then ultimately Peter Lowe picked him up as a speaker. And Dan worked with Peter Lowe for 9 years, doing speaking with Peter Lowe. And he ultimately sold $9 million worth of magnetic marketing in 9 years. They were essentially selling $1 million worth of that a year. And Dan was getting half of that money. He was making $500,000 a year. But what he ultimately did is after 9 years, Dan quit the Peter Lowe events because he wanted to have more control and be able to travel less. And so he again went back to kind of doing what he had been doing before, doing coaching, putting people in a room on his own and doing that type of thing. And he did that for a few years, and then he ran into Bill Glazer. He and Bill Glazer met up. And Bill Glazer and Dan formed Glazer Kennedy Inner Circle. And Glazer Kennedy Inner Circle was formed in around 2002. And I think that what happened is shortly after they formed the company, Dan ultimately sold the company to Bill. But Dan was certainly still working with the company as far as doing the info summits and super conferences. But a few years after that they had actually put this thing together, Bill actually bought the company. And then around 2010 or 2011, GKIC was actually sold. Bill sold the company to a group, and he ultimately retired. Dan still does some work with GKIC, but essentially he doesn't really have an ownership stake in the company. So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is I'm going to actually go through some review, and we're going to talk about some of what we've already talked about, and I'll give you a little bit more background, because what I want you to get from everything that I'm talking about is this is all about attitude. It's all attitudinal. Where he came from and the thought process and the mindset that caused him to do what he was doing. So the first thing let's talk about is the speaking. Where did Dan Kennedy learn the speaking business from? He learned the speaking business from James Tolson. And James Tolson learned that whole process from Glenn Turner. The next thing you'd want to think about is where did he learn the copywriting from? Well, the copywriting came from a lot of different places. But remember the four email sequence or the 4 mail sequence? He got that from the collection companies because he had a lot of debt, and so he would get 4 notices. So he got a lot of his copywriting essentially from the collection industry. When we talk about scheduling, and I want you to think about something. First of all, if I haven't mentioned this before, Dan's time is not scheduled, it's scripted. So Dan has 15-minute coaching sessions, but they're actually 14 minutes because you're on the phone with him 14 minutes, and at the end of the 14th minute he hangs up because he's going to the next call. Everything that he actually does is scripted. Now, how do you get an appointment with Dan? Let me tell you what that looks like. You call his secretary. She's going to tell you it's going to be $14,600 to have essentially a strategy session day, which is where everything starts. And then she's probably going to lay out the fact that if you're wanting copywriting, that's going to be $175,000 and up. And she's going to give you fees for different things that you would want to have done. If you get through that hurdle, she's going to send you a box of stuff that you're going to need to go through. Once you have went through that box of stuff, you're going to need to actually write a letter out, and it has to be handwritten. It's going to be 2 or 3 pages telling about your business, what you need Dan to do, and all of that. And you're going to need to fax that to Arizona. Once that is faxed, that information is actually put in a priority mailbox. Actually, it's UPS, and it's sent to Dan. Dan gets a box from his office once a week. Dan actually lives in Cleveland. His office is in Arizona, so he gets a box of stuff once a week. He's going to go through your content, and then you will actually get a call scheduled with Dan if it looks like you guys can move forward. So there's a very, very big process here, and some people will not follow through with the process. Dan's created this process to only work with serious people, because if you're not serious about the 3rd or 4th step, you're going to drop out. But this is all takeaway selling, and this all comes from Gary Halbert. So let me explain the backdrop here. Dan knew Gary Halbert from when he lived in Ohio. Gary Halbert ultimately was doing $7,000 seminars in Florida, and Dan was invited to speak. And so Dan showed up, and this is what happened. You got to keep in mind there's 300 people in this room who gave Gary Halbert $7,000 to be there. Gary Halbert arrives late at his own seminar. He shows up wearing shorts and flip-flops and a t-shirt, and he has a hat, and the hat says "Clients Suck." And Gary essentially walks up on stage, and for the first 45 minutes of the seminar, he essentially says, you can't hire me. I'm not taking any clients. I don't want to talk to you about any projects. I don't want clients, and you can't hire me for copywriting, so just don't even try to hire me. And for the next 3 days, everyone in that room tried to hire Gary Halbert for copywriting. Now, Dan was amazed by this, and Dan went to Gary and essentially said, Gary, I don't understand this. You must be doing really well. You're not looking for clients. And Gary said, I need clients really bad. That's exactly why I am doing this. It was all takeaway selling. It was all putting himself out there and saying, you can't hire me, which caused people more to want to hire him. And it was also created from Nero Wolfe. So Nero Wolfe is the private detective that's a recluse. He's very, very hard to get a hold of. He's a grumpy old man. If you actually have the money to pay him, though, he is the best in the world at what he does, and he stays on a case until it's solved. So that, again, is where Dan Kennedy got the scheduling. So we're going to talk about coaching for a few minutes. Dan started coaching completely by accident. He went to the National Speakers Association to learn to speak better. He found that he was speaking better than most of the people there. And then on his way out of town, Buster Crabbe essentially hired him and said, I want you to teach me to get more speaking gigs. And when he got that first client, a light bulb went off in Dan's head that said, wait a minute, maybe I could get a lot of clients who would give me money to help them get more speaking gigs. He rented the mailing list from the National Speakers Association. He sent every one of those people an offer for a newsletter that said he would explain to them how to actually get more speaking gigs. He sold that newsletter, and when he sold that newsletter, he started getting coaching clients in the speaking niche. Dan has probably made more coaches millionaires than anyone on the planet. I mean, you want to think about something. Joe Polish is a direct descendant of Dan Kennedy. Yannick Silver is a direct descendant of Dan Kennedy. Rory Fatt is a direct descendant of Dan Kennedy. And I could give you 20 or 30 names of people who are millionaires from coaching who started out working with Dan, and Dan ultimately helped them to build a coaching business. So Dan has made more people millionaires in the coaching business than probably anyone who I can think of. And that all derived from that first coaching client that he ultimately got. So the last area that I'd want to talk about here is the newsletter business. And again, you want to keep in mind, Dan said in the Advanced Coaching Consulting product that most of his clients emanated from the newsletters that he started. And how did Dan start the newsletter business? Completely by accident. He ran into Buster Crabbe at the airport. He ended up running the NSA's list. He started a newsletter for coaches, for speakers. And once he started the newsletter for speakers, he just essentially did the same thing in a bunch of different niches. So he thought, wait a minute, the newsletter works in the speaking niche. Maybe it will work in the coaching niche. Maybe it will work in the copywriting niche. Maybe it will work in these other niches. And essentially, he just multiplied his success by doing that in a number of different areas. Well, I do really want to thank you all for taking a look at this video today. I know the video is very, very long. What I wanted to give you all is a very clear idea of where Dan Kennedy got his superpowers, how this all came about. And I feel that I've really laid this out for you. But I do appreciate you watching the video, and stick around. Like I said, if you're not in my private coaching group, make sure you jump in there, because we're going to have different videos about a number of these gurus and essentially show you how they actually got started. But I appreciate you watching the video today, and thanks a lot.